John Hardison and Elizabeth Hancock Redd, together with their household, were among the first people to cultivate this land in the Spanish Fork River bottoms and establish a permanent settlement in the southern part of Utah Valley. Here they found an abundance of meadows, timber, and water. It proved to be a good place to farm and raise livestock. The Redds left a home and productive farm in Rutherford County near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, to take part in the founding of a place of refuge for the Latter-day Saints. Tennessee, however, was not their original home. John and Elizabeth had been born in Sneads Ferry, Stump Sound Township, Onslow County, North Carolina, at the end of the 19th century, and like their parents before them, had lived and farmed near a freshwater inlet made by the New River as it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. John Hardison Redd was 26 years old when he married Elizabeth Hancock in 1826. She was 28 at the time of the marriage. John had received an inheritance of 400 acres from his maternal grandfather, and within 2 years of his marriage, he began to buy and sell parcels of land to create his own farm. In his will, Elizabeth's father granted her ownership of 2 enslaved sisters, Venice and Cheney. When Elizabeth married John, Venice and eventually Cheney came with her into her new home. Six children were born to John and Elizabeth while they lived in Sneads Ferry, North Carolina, the first of whom, Edward, died as a young infant. 3 daughters, Anne Mariah, Anne Elizabeth, and Mary Catherine, followed Edward's birth. Then 2 more sons, Lemuel Hardison and John Holt, were born by 1838. While living in Onslow County, Venice gave birth to a son, Luke, and Cheney had a daughter, Amy. Another enslaved girl, Marinda, became a member of the household during this period. It is possible she too was Cheney's daughter. At the close of the 1830s, the Redds left North Carolina to follow John's sister and brother-in-law, John and Mary Redd Holt, into Tennessee, 670 miles away. The Holts and the Redds farmed several miles outside Murfreesboro in Rutherford County. This move proved to be an important turning point in all their lives, because this is where they learned about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The church sent missionaries into Tennessee in 1841, but it was not until the spring of 1843 that the Redds were able to hear the message of the gospel. John Redd and John Holt traveled 17 miles in a downpour to listen to Elder John D. Lee preach. At the conclusion of Lee's sermon, Redd invited him to come to his home and share the good news with his family and neighbors. Mormon missionaries were not always welcomed in the South. In fact, when John Redd extended the invitation to Lee, he told him he could not preach publicly, for his life would be in danger. Lee rejected Redd's advice to meet in secret, and instead insisted his visit be advertised. Lee's strategy worked, and after preaching in the neighborhood, he baptized a number of converts. However, that is not to say there were no troublemakers present at the meetings. Lee's autobiography reported,
John Hardison Redd appointed a meeting to be held at his place, and he told the people that he did not want any person to come into his yard unless they came intending to behave. that if there was any violence used, someone would get hurt. I preached at his house that afternoon. A fearful storm raged during most of the time, but this was fortunate, for it kept the mob away. While I was preaching, a drunken wag interrupted me and called me a liar. Red was sitting near me with 2 large pistols, which he called his peacemakers. This insult was not more than out of the fellow's mouth when Red caught him by the neck and rushed him out of the house into the rain. Red was a kind-hearted, generous man, but would not stand for abuse.
Elder John D. Lee stayed at the Reds' home while he continued to preach in the area. On June 7, 1843, he wrote the following in his diary.
In the morning before I left them, Mrs. Red gave me her hand as a token of her sincerity in the cause of truth, but was not prepared to be immersed at that time.
Just 10 days later, on June 17th, Elizabeth was ready. She and John, together with Venice and Cheney, were baptized and inducted into the kingdom. Anne Maria and Anne Elizabeth were baptized later on that summer. In August, John H. Red was ordained to the priesthood office of teacher. John D. Lee organized the Friendship Branch and called John as clerk. In the spring of 1844, John Hardison Red traveled up to Nauvoo, Illinois, where he received his patriarchal blessing from Hiram Smith, just 2 months before Hiram and his brother, the prophet Joseph Smith, were martyred. Patriarch Smith promised John,
"Thy name shall be perpetuated from generation to generation, and you shall be blessed in your house and habitation. Honor shall crown your head, notwithstanding the wickedness of the world."
It seems Elizabeth did not accompany her husband to Nauvoo. She had given birth to the youngest of the Reds' children, Benjamin Jones, in 1842, and may have stayed at home to care for him and their other young children. The following year, in April of 1845, John made another trip up to Nauvoo to deliver tithing collected from members of the Friendship Branch. Their donations recorded in the Nauvoo Daybook show contributions made both in kind and in silver. John gave the church 2 of his guns. His daughters donated socks. Elizabeth gave $1 in silver. Even Venice, although enslaved, contributed $1 in silver. In July 1847, John Red once again traveled north, but this time to Summer Quarters, a farm in Nebraska where John D. Lee, under assignment from Brigham Young, was cultivating crops to be used by displaced members of the church as they prepared to go west. Apparently, Red and Lee discussed the idea of gathering to the Rocky Mountains, and Red must have been undecided as to whether or not he wanted to uproot his family yet again. In his diary, Lee described John Red as
considerably difficult in his mind with reference to moving west.
But John did not remain undecided for long. By May of the following year, his mind was made up. He wrote to George A. Smith to say that he had expected to ask the apostle to send an elder to go with me to North Carolina, but now anticipated a hope of going to the west. It appears John intended to serve a mission to North Carolina, but now knew his time would have to be spent in preparing to go to the Salt Lake Valley. It was the spring of 1850 by the time he had sold all his land and assembled the necessary provisions for the long journey ahead. At the time the Reds began their overland trek, John Hardison Red stood at the head of a large Southern household. When he signed letters as John H. Red and People, he referred to all his dependents, both white and black. All of them were part of his household. John left Tennessee with his wife, Elizabeth, their 3 daughters and 3 sons, together with 5 enslaved and 1 indentured servant. They traveled to Utah Territory with the James Pace Company. John Hardison Red kept a journal as he crossed the Great Plains. In it, he recounted weather and conditions in camp, but did not mention that he and his son Lemuel contracted cholera. John did, however, recount a celebration.
Thursday morning, July 25th. We lay by yesterday, it being the 24th of July, to celebrate the day in commemoration of the entering of the pioneers that day 3 years ago into the valley of the Great Salt Lake. Our opportunities of celebrating the day was very limited on this almost barren prairie, but we rested our teams as we thought it a righteous act, and was well entertained in the evening by an interesting discourse.
The Red household arrived in Great Salt Lake City late in September 1850, but almost immediately traveled on to the southern end of Utah Valley to establish a new Mormon community named Palmyra. The Reds, the Holts, and the Paces, who had all come from Tennessee, began to build homes on the Spanish Fork River in what came to be known as the Upper Settlement. Another group of families chose to live a few miles west in what they called the Lower Settlement. The Palmyra pioneers were anxious to plant a crop, but in the dry climate of that high desert valley, they couldn't rely on rain to provide needed water. Instead, they worked together to dig ditches and build an irrigation system to carry water from the river and transform this valley into the fertile farm acreage it is today. In addition to the arduous work of breaking ground on new farms, building homes and businesses, and caring for livestock, early Utahns had to provide their own clothing and shoes or trade with each other for necessities. John Red's notebook contains a record of shoes he cobbled and boots he repaired for others in the community. January 1851, John Hardison Red and wealthy Salt Lake merchant Enoch Reese formed a partnership, the Reese and Red Company, to build a sawmill on the Spanish Fork River. Later, other partners bought out Reese, but the venture continued. Five months after this auspicious beginning of the new year, John and Elizabeth suffered a terrible loss when their 17-year-old daughter, Mary Catherine, died unexpectedly within a few hours of becoming ill. It seems Mary Catherine's death and the back-breaking work of life on the frontier did not destroy John and Elizabeth's commitment to their faith. Instead, they and the other members of their household who had been baptized in Tennessee chose to demonstrate their continued dedication to their beliefs by receiving rebaptisms in June 1852. On the same occasion, John and Elizabeth's sons Lemuel, John Holt, and Benjamin were baptized to become members of the church. Two of the Reds' younger enslaved servants, Miranda and Amy, were also added to the church at the time. Immediately afterwards, John H. Red was ordained to the office of high priest and received his endowment the next year. By the spring of 1853, things in Palmyra were going well. Work on the sawmill was continuing, and both the upper and lower settlements were growing. There were enough residents of Palmyra to form a church branch and stake. John Red was called as a counselor to the stake president. Despite having lost his daughter 2 years before, in a letter John wrote to a friend, he conveyed his satisfaction with life in his new home and remarked upon his good health and prosperity. However, life in Utah was not without its difficulties. In the summer of that year, Chief Wakar led his band of Utes in attacking the new settlers in what came to be known as the Walker War. The Utes raided cattle and burned John's unfinished sawmill to the ground. The families of both the upper and lower settlements were forced to seek safety in a fort built near the lower settlement. Fort Palmyra was constructed by building cabins side by side with an open courtyard and well in the center. Fort Palmyra was crowded with over 400 residents by the fall of 1853. Apostle George A. Smith visited the fort, and as he conducted a drill, John Redd took the opportunity to ask his permission to build a second fort nearer to the upper settlement, according to George Hicks, who witnessed the encounter.
Redd was a man of sense and education, and a man of good financial abilities.
Nevertheless, Apostle Smith rebuked Redd by thundering,
"No, you cannot! Brother Red, the course you are taking is the last remains of an ill-spent, worn-out Gentile life."
Undeterred, John appealed to President Brigham Young, who agreed that his proposed site was a good one. President Young encouraged the upper settlers to build Fort St. Luke on what is now Main Street in present-day Spanish Fork. They built the fort with adobe walls that were 2 feet thick and 20 feet high. It was considered one of the best fortifications in Utah. Late in autumn 1853, tragedy struck the Redd household again. 15-year-old John Holt Redd was thrown from a horse and died. His mother, Elizabeth, unable to eat, took to her bed and died 3 days later. With her death, John lost his wife of 27 years, a woman devoted to family and willing to join him in building a community and home on the frontier. Together, they committed to a new faith, suffered the loss of 3 children, and never stopped working to provide for their surviving sons and daughters. Elizabeth had received her patriarchal blessing at the hands of Isaac Morley. He promised her,
"Thy children and thy children's children shall bless thee and revere thy name for the kindness of a mother. Thy table shall be crowned with the blessings of the earth. Thou shalt enter into the mansions of thy father, prepared for thee from the foundation of the world."
In 1855, after the end of the Walker War, the Utah Territorial Legislature granted a city charter to Fort St. Luke, creating the town of Spanish Fork. Brigham Young approved the location of what had been the upper settlement as the best place to develop a city in southern Utah Valley, saying, "That is where it always should have been." He eventually ordered the residents of the lower settlement of Palmyra to move east into Spanish Fork. The land close to the foothills provided much more fertile soil for farming. Now was the time. John Redd was able to put down roots and create a home in the West. John Hardison Redd was elected to civic offices in Palmyra and Spanish Fork. He served as an alderman in the latter. In that capacity, he performed the duties of a justice of the peace. While living in both forts, the Redds had been fortunate enough to live in rudimentary log cabins. Others, who were not as well off, had built dugouts in the center courtyards and lived in those. Dugouts were pits 4 to 5 feet deep, with steps leading down into the room from one end, and a roof usually made of willows and mud. Many continued to live in dugouts in the new city of Spanish Fork. So many, in fact, that the city was known as Gopher Town. One of the most difficult times in early Spanish Fork began in the spring and summer of 1856, when very dry weather damaged the newly sprouting crops. This drought coincided with the worst grasshopper invasion of the 19th century in Utah. Farmers lost 70% of their cereal, vegetable, and fruit crop. A bitter winter followed, bringing with it a measles epidemic. Many pioneers suffered with hunger and sickness. A descendant of Spanish Fork resident Zebedee Coltrane remembered that the Coltranes were often unable to find bread and had to subsist on pigweed greens.
John Redd and his family, who were better off during this time, sent their servant to Zebedee's home with something for his family to eat. This kindness was greatly appreciated by his family, and at times, it was the only food they had to eat.
In August of 1856, John wrote to his son and daughter-in-law who were away on a mission. He casually mentioned 2 marriages that had taken place while they were away.
John W. Barry is married to Emily Davis, and myself to Miss Mary Lewis, a fine-looking girl of about 16 years of age. We all, both white and black, have a desire to see you. Ever remaining your affectionate father, people, and friends.
On the heels of the Mormon Reformation in January 1858, John Hardison Redd consecrated his property to the church's trustee in trust, Brigham Young. His consecration deed lists real property, livestock, and household goods amounting to $2,350. By signing this document, John once again demonstrated his devotion to the church and its leaders. In June 1858, less than 2 years after his second marriage, John Hardison Redd was kicked by a horse and died a few days later from his injuries. He left a young wife and a baby girl, Mary Ann Redd, not yet a year old. John is buried here in the Spanish Fork Pioneer Cemetery along with his wife Elizabeth, his daughter Mary Catherine, and his son John Holt. Amy, Cheney's daughter, is also buried here. John died without having written a will, so his young widow, Mary, and his eldest son, Lemuel, divided his property. In doing so, they took the extraordinary step to grant a portion of his land and goods to 3 of the enslaved members of his household who were still living in Spanish Fork. Venice, Luke, and Miranda received bequests that were comparable to those his legal heirs received. With this action, these 3 gained their freedom. Through his death and the generosity of his heirs, John Hardison Redd gave his people the land and means they needed to establish their own homes. He provided for them all, both white and black.